The next topic is actually about something that's arisen over the last few years, which is identity politics. I think this actually, I started to think about this over 10 years ago when David Cameron became Prime Minister. And one thing that I heard people who were arguing against him were saying was he has no right to govern this country or make it better because he's never really seen, economic hardship. He went to Eton, he's had a privileged lifestyle. And more recently, in cases of racism, people have been saying, you can't comment on my experience of racism or sexism or whatever because you're not a woman or you're not, BAME. And so some people say, well, it's fair enough, you can't comment on someone's group experience if you're not past them. But on the other hand, people say, how could you ever expect people to learn? We don't apply that when it comes to someone learning about cancer to try and find a cure. You don't have to have experienced cancer yourself. And so I just want to ask it from a Torah perspective, because I was just thinking recently about the fact that the greatest Jewish leader of all time, Moses, who brought the Jewish slaves out of slavery, himself grew up in luxury and was never himself a slave. And I thought, that's quite an interesting point. So what does the Torah have to say about this question of leadership, understanding suffering, and identity politics?
Okay, this is a very good question. First of all, I don't think I'm the last word on this. I think you can make an argument on both sides, and I think both sides have a validity to them. I would like to suggest that one could argue that without having been through a certain trauma or disadvantage or suffering or identity trauma, one can empathize in a very real way. I'd like to suggest that is true. I've no doubt that some of your challenge is correct, that no matter how much you empathize and no matter how big a person you are, you're probably missing something if you haven't been through the experience yourself, probably. I personally feel that having not been through an experience yourself, you might have some advantages too, although they're probably outweighed by the disadvantages. But I would say this, I say even if we concede that a person who's not been through a particular trauma or identity trauma is lacking because of that, I don't think it invalidates them from playing a role in advancing the cause of people at that level. And let me give you a few examples and try to convince you that this is true. But I wouldn't be stubborn about this, Ollie, and if any of your viewers differ, I would be open to hearing a different view. I don't think this is that I have the monopoly on the correct insight into this. First of all, let's take your example. I'll give you two historical examples that I think are salient. One is Moses, as you said quite correctly, brought up in privilege, raised as an Egyptian prince, and then has to identify with the slaves. In fact, the problem's worse than that. He was actually part of the priestly caste, as you know, and not only was he privileged living in the palace, but all the Kohanim, the Levim, were not actually enslaved during the Egyptian ordeal. So that is quite correct. On the other hand, he certainly knew who he was. There's no question that he knew who his family, his parents were. He was nursed and suckled by his mother, so there's no question that he grew up fully aware of both identities. I think he suffered in modern terms, he probably suffered a schizoid trauma at a different level. That means having to choose with whom to identify. Now, on the one hand, he was privileged and must have had a debt of gratitude to the Egyptian elite that had saved him and educated him and trained him in leadership and kingship. On the other hand, he certainly knew who his parents were and what they were going through. In their view, there's no question that the Kohanim, even though they may not have been enslaved in the formal sense, they were certainly part of the trauma of the Egyptian experience. You may or may not know that when he went out and was faced with his ordeal, his first ordeal of identity, the crisis of identity, watching an Egyptian beating a Jew, and he was challenged to take sides, you probably know that the Torah says, Vayifen koi v'choi. He looked this way and that way. And the simple interpretation is he looked around to see if anyone was watching before he defended the Jew and in some fashion defeated or slew the Egyptian. But there's a well-known interpretation that means this. He looked this way and that way. In other words, he deeply looked into his own crisis of identity. Which one would he side with? He looked to the Moses who was the royal Egyptian prince, with he had a deep allegiance and gratitude, and he looked deeply into the side of the traumatized sufferer. And I have no doubt that is true. And I think both of those sides added something to his leadership skills and his deep ability to empathize with both sides. And you see clearly that the historical truth is that he became the person that he be, probably the greatest human being who ever lived, despite not having gone through the trauma in the conventional sense. The second example I was going to give you was from Gautama Buddha. And why not do a little self-promotion? So give me a moment to show you my book on the subject. I wrote a book some time ago about Buddhism and Judaism. So here you have here you have a copy, Letters to a Buddhist Jew. Myself and David Gottlieb, who's a very wonderful, I don't know if you can see that picture.
Yeah.
But David Gottlieb is a very wonderful Chicago Jew who was deeply involved in Buddhism, in fact ordained as a Buddhist teacher. Very special and wonderful individual, and the two of us published that book. If you speak French, you can get the book in French. And we're doing other languages now as well, Spanish and so on. But this book goes into, and I mention this because there's a very interesting historical parallel. Something like 1,000 years after the story of Moses that you mentioned is a very interestingly parallel story about the Buddha. He was a Hindu prince living in the palace, had never seen suffering, was totally unaware of suffering, lived a charmed and gifted life in his father's palace. And when he was a young man, happened to chance outside the palace walls, unofficially, and came across the suffering of the world.
Right.
And identified with it and left to become a itinerant and a mystic and a teacher, and venerated as a great teacher of humanity. So very interesting parallel. A prince of privilege identifying with a world of suffering, definitely an echo of the biblical story itself. And it's very well known, and if you have any background or exposure to Buddhism, you'll certainly know that it's a deeply empathic path, where despite the fact that he was, and I think they would argue that because of his privilege, he was able to be shocked into an empathy. You know, if he'd grown up in that as reality, who knows if he would have had that sensitivity. But imagine a person living the kind of privilege where you don't step on the floor without them putting a priceless carpet under your foot. And then you go out and you see the trauma of unnecessary starvation and brutality in a world soaked in blood. What would that do to somebody who had that background? I think you could argue that there might be a very powerful sensitizing effect that might not have happened had you been raised. So I think you can argue the case both ways. Let me say this. As a doctor, this question is often raised. They say, you know, doctor, how can you empathize with somebody who has cancer if you've not been through it? Or a more common example is, how can you empathize with an addict? And how can you be a therapist dealing in addiction treatment when you haven't actually been there yourself and known the vulnerability and the depth of attraction to the substance? And the usual response to that is, well, do you expect every therapist to be an addict? Do you have to go through that? Do you have to have been that? Is that necessary? And common experience shows clearly that's not necessary. If you challenge me and say, are the best therapists indeed those who've been through it? That's quite possible, yes. I've come across quite a few people in my professional career who are suffering very serious addictions of one form or another. And it's very powerful to hear their story and to hear when they highlight the vulnerabilities and they issue the warnings to the people they work with. It has a certain credibility that you just don't find among people who haven't been there. I think that's true. However, the field acknowledges very clearly that people who have not been through those experiences, but have spent a lifetime, shall I say, wallowing or steeped in those issues, can certainly be extremely insightful and empathic. I mean, I had the privilege of meeting a number of times Rabbi Tatz, one of the world's great alcohol and drug addiction experts, with a remarkable story, a Hasidic Rebbe who's a psychiatrist. I never forget the experience of him telling his own story and his own personal, medical school experiences coming from a Hasidic world. Fascinating story. Mm. When you hear his level of empathy and identification and wisdom gathered over many years of working with people in the field, what is he doing? He's calling on his own personal issues, even though they may not have been addiction issues. But, if you've been through any sort of bullying or trauma, you can enlarge that experience and connect it with a different experience you might not have been through. That's a part of intellectual maturity. And there's no question that people like that can become experts. And the proof is in the pudding, the experience that they've had and the success they've had in their fields, even though they've not been necessarily through the same trauma. And finally, I'd like to say this. It's part of spiritual maturity to be able to empathize. Let me put it to you this way, Ollie. At a very deep level, you can only love yourself. Just like you can only know yourself intimately, you can really only love yourself. How do you love someone else? The wrong way is to develop an I-thou relationship. I love you. That's not correct. Not only is it not correct, but it often ends up in a very immature love of self. Namely, I love you because you make me feel good, which really means I love you. As the great Bala Musa say, it's like saying I love fish. You know what you mean? You're going to kill it and grill it and eat it, and you say you love it. If you really love the fish, you'd put it back in the water and let it swim back to its mother. You don't mean you love the fish. You mean you love you and you're ready to kill for that. When a man says to a woman, I love you, and he means you make me feel good, that is not love at all. That is mercenary, relationship. That has a word in the, relating to one of the oldest professions in the world, which I'm not going to mention, but that's business or worse. Real love is love of self expanded to include another. Real love means I love myself deeply and richly, and I regard you as part of myself. When a man says he loves a woman because he understands his being extends into her, she's a part of his own being. A Jewish marriage is a reconstitution of an original oneness in the spiritual world. You found your other half and bonded back with it. Or to give Rabbi Tatz's classic example, that parents always love their children more than the children love the parents. Parents always love their children more than the children love their parents, because you extend into them. You've given into them. Don't love what you get. You love what you give. Our generation are trained that you love what you get. Someone makes you feel good, you love them. That is a very mistaken notion. If you give yourself to somebody unconditionally, you love them. And let me hasten to say this. There's a wrong psychological understanding, and some transmitter of Desna's teaching like this inaccurately. Like this. If I invest myself in you and give myself to you, of course I love you. You're part of me. It's a self-love. In other words, I've given myself to you. I've worked very hard for you. Therefore, I love you, because it's a way of loving myself. That can be said very wrongly. Here's the correct way. I love you because you are me, not because when I've extended myself into you and I see yourself as a part of myself, when I see my child as an extension of myself, and I love them as I love myself. That's exactly when a teacher has a student, and they pour their creative energy into their student, and the student develops, and develops way beyond the teacher. The teacher sees himself or herself in that student, and correctly so, and there's become a oneness. The Hebrew word for love is ahava. It has two fascinating characteristics, that word. It's based on hav, which means to give, and secondly, it adds up to 13. Exactly the same number as the word echad, which means one. When two have become one, of course there's a love, much deeper than I love you. You've become part of me. A more mature person can love not only a spouse, but children as well, and a broader family. A bigger spiritual person can love the neighborhood as well. A person bigger than that can love the Jewish people and take whatever happens to the Jewish people very personally. Somebody bigger than that can feel for all of humanity in a genuine fashion. A person spiritually mature will hear about suffering anywhere in the world. It will hurt them personally. You are not a mature human being if you can hear of human suffering someplace and not identify with it. And somebody bigger than that can feel the suffering of the world. As the mystics call it, the suffering of the Shekhinah. That means when humans are suffering, they think, how's God feeling about his children going through this? And they can feel the pain of the Shekhinah. Now, you can't fake that. You have to be a big person to do it. And today you'll find it's very unusual for someone even to feel one other person's suffering. But a real love is an extension into self. When I moved to Israel, I joined a medical practice there run by my brother-in-law. And once I was walking in the street in this little town, and an old couple, old Holocaust surviving couple, European couple, were hobbling down the road, helping support each other. And he told me, he said, you see that couple, the first time they came into my surgery, they hobbled into the room and they sat down across my desk, and the woman had an ulcer on her leg. And as she was moving her stocking to show me the ulcer, the husband leaned across the desk and he said, Doctor, we have a sore leg. We have a sore leg. Not she or it, we. A big person can identify with others at a very mature level. And if you get to that level, it doesn't matter whether you've been through addiction or not. When your child is going through a certain pain, whether you've been through that pain or not, Ollie, you feel that pain. Not because you've been through it, but because you are part of that experience. And therefore, I think you make a good point when you suggest that it may be advantageous to have been through something yourself in order to identify with it, but I don't think it's necessary. You talk about gender politics or political politics, or whichever level of prejudice and persecution you're talking about. Probably some are easier than others to have suffered. I must tell you my personal experience. I don't mind admitting that as a doctor, I'll admit to you quite openly that when I deal with medical issues that I've suffered myself, or, whether it's when I say medical issues, some problem I've had myself, some pain I've suffered myself, I'm much more sympathetic. I'm much more sympathetic. When I deal with somebody who has an alcohol problem, which has never been my issue, I just get very frustrated. Yeah, why are you doing this to yourself? I mean, it's very hard for me to empathize.
But do you think that the reason why God chose Moses, as opposed to any other Israelite, part of the lesson the Torah is teaching us is that empathy can be achieved even if you are not yourself the victim?
And the reason for that is we have a very interesting principle in Torah that any way a thing is in the world, it was designed to be that way. Again, anything that is in the world, not by human action, anything that is in the world because God created it that way, was designed that way. There are no accidents, which means Moses needed to be a person developing empathy from within Egyptian society. By the way, there were other reasons he needed that too. He needed a training in royalty and dealing with kings, and he needed that as well. But there's a very deep reason. He needed to draw the Jewish people out of an Egyptian reality. And he needed to deeply understand what it was and be part of that to wrench them out of it. But anyway, in summary, I would sum up by saying I think your point is cogent and valid. And I'm sure there's big advantage to be had by having been in a situation yourself. But I think for the reasons that I've argued, one can empathize very deeply and in a very real way, even if you've not had the particular suffering that the person you're dealing with has had.
Yeah, and just finally, just before we move on, I can't help but think, isn't there something a bit sad that the only way we can love others is by tapping into our own self-love? Isn't that a bit sad that that self-love will always be the most powerful drive?
Ollie, let me warn here against misunderstanding this concept. There's an immature way to do this and a mature way. The immature way is to tap into your own self-love in an egotistical fashion and see everyone else as an expression of your ego. That is exactly not what I'm saying. But if you tap into your own self-love as a self-respect, an understanding of the genuine depth and cosmic proportions of your own soul, again, you can be a very big person, a very accomplished person, a super accomplished person, and have total self-awareness and self-esteem of your greatness with not a shred of ego. That's totally, I'm not saying it's easy. The ego is a very powerful enemy. But in Judaism, we are not looking. We mentioned Buddhism before. Many people who have had a training in the East tell me they were taught to be nothing, to negate themselves completely. That is not the Jewish view at all. The Jewish view is to fan to a fever pitch every aspect of your personality and your desire and ambition, but to kill ego completely. I'm not doing this for the childish me. And a person has achieved that. That means total view, honest, objective view of their own capacity and their own potential and their own ambitions and desires with not a shred of egotistical immaturity, and expand that to another human being. That is a genuine love. Of course, Ollie, as soon as they extend that to another human being, it doesn't mean they want to make the other person in their image. On the contrary, they'll respect the other person's uniqueness and specialness. And we're not talking about an orchestra where everybody plays the same note on the same instrument. On the contrary, we're talking about the love that exists in the tension between the difference between people.
Right. It's learning, it's using your understanding of your own self-respect to apply that to others.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.